Today's event, we have got a lot to get through in the next hour and a half. We're really thrilled you can join us. It is a very big, ambitious and exciting online event with a big task to cultivate the common ground between agriculture and conservation. We are looking at what unites farmers and environmentalists globally. Who knows what we will discuss and discover in the next 90 minutes. To kick us off, I would first like to invite Siri Sendashonga, who is Global Director of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about the organization which brings us all together today. Over to you, Siri.
Hello, Anna, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you. So good to see you. And what a pleasure to be in this event. So first of all, let me introduce myself. As you said, I am Syriac, but known as Siri. It's easier to pronounce. Sendashonga, Global Director for the Program and Policy Group of IUCN. And today I am privileged to stand in for our Director General, Bruno Oberle, who unfortunately could not be in this event because of some health issues. So it's a big task for me to step in for the Director General and welcome all the participants in this event, particularly you, Anna, who has kindly agreed to be our moderator and facilitator, as well as the panelists and all the people who will take part in this. IUCN is the organization that prepared the report that is actually the reason why we are meeting today, having this event. And I am sure you will get the opportunity to hear more about the report and how it came to be. So for now, just let me welcome you and say a few things to situate the context in which this report is coming. So the spread of the devastating COVID pandemic, climate change, and unprecedented biodiversity loss send us a clear message. Time has come for humanity to reconsider our relationship to nature. In most of the past century, decision makers have treated nature as a peripheral, considered at best as something worth interest, but often as an obstacle to development. The growing consensus is telling us now that human beings and nature need to be both placed at the center of our preoccupations, at the center of a sustainable development agenda. Few socioeconomic sectors are as central as agriculture is to humanity's relationship with nature. Farming deeply depends on nature to provide food, feed, fiber, energy, and livelihoods for billions of people. In recent decades, the agriculture sector has significantly increased productivity and drastically reduced the number of food insecure people worldwide. This is definitely an immense achievement, and we are all very proud of that. However, this has come at a very high cost for nature. Agriculture expansion and intensification have driven soil, water, and forest degradation, thereby undermining the agricultural sector's own future, because it needs all these elements to continue existing. Therefore, business as usual is not an option. While the harmful effects of conventional agriculture are becoming evident to society, many promising policies and incentives are emerging. They seek to encourage agroecological practices and governance schemes that achieve multiple benefits for farmers and society as a whole. Among others, producing food, storing carbon, retaining moisture, conserving biodiversity, and improving farmers' resilience. During the last IUCN Congress held in Hawaii in 2016, IUCN members had committed to a number of commitments known as Hawaii commitments. One of them was a commitment to addressing the challenges of sustaining the global food supply while conserving nature. Bringing our expertise to foster knowledge, policy, and practice development to achieve these multiple benefits is now a major priority for our institution. And in the next program of work that our members are currently debating with a view to approve to define our strategic plan for the next 4 years, 21 to 24, agriculture is indeed a major topic, a major area of focus. And this is why, in this regard, we are very proud that IUCN published 2 months ago, this September, a key report on agriculture and biodiversity, known as Common Ground, Restoring Land Health and Sustainable Agriculture, which will be the focus of the event today. This report highlights the immense potential and the monetary value of developing agriculture as a nature-based solution to face our societal most pressing challenges like food and water security and providing habitats to countless species. My colleague Magnus Stewart, who will be speaking later, will tell you more about this notion of agriculture as a nature-based solution. We are convinced that a renewed dialogue between conservation and agricultural communities around a common ground of shared solutions, promoting approaches that restore soil and landscape biodiversity, will be a stepping stone in that direction. So these are the few words that I wanted to say to set the context, and I thank you, Anna, and all of you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Siri. So next up, we are delighted to welcome 3 fantastic speakers who are going to set out for us the big themes, the big messages we're going to be exploring today. Next year, the UK will host the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26 in Glasgow. So it's a great time to talk to Lord Zach Goldsmith, UK Minister for Pacific and the Environment, and he's going to talk to us about the way forward for global agriculture.
The Common Ground report comes at a critical time. We've been almost overwhelmed in recent months by scientific reports and assessments of the state of the world's nature. Kew Gardens has told us that 2/5 of the world's plants now face extinction, which is roughly twice what we thought was the case just 4 years ago. IPBES have reported that populations of key species have declined by a staggering 70% since 1970, that 1 million species face extinction. The world's fisheries are on the brink, and we're losing the equivalent of 30 football pitches worth of tropical forest every single minute. Now, it is, of course, cataclysmic ecologically, but it's not just an ecological issue. It is a humanitarian issue as well. Over 1 billion people, for instance, depend directly on forests for their survival, for their livelihoods. Ultimately, we all depend on the health and viability of the planet we inhabit. And so unless we change our approach, and radically, there will be a terrible price to pay. Agricultural production was transformed in the last century. New technologies helped to multiply yields and lift millions out of poverty and hunger. But as we now know, there have been unintended harms, and these threaten sustainable food production now and in the future. Agriculture, in particular, agricultural commodities, is the cause of around 80% of the world's ecosystem degradation. And that in turn is contributing heavily to climate change, to appalling biodiversity loss. And it is fundamentally undermining nature's capacity to support life. In a vicious cycle, the task of growing food for a fast-growing human population is made so much more complicated and unpredictable by the very climate change it is contributing to. And all the time, the basis of agriculture, healthy soil, has been fatally undermined. Globally, more than half of the agricultural land that we use is now degraded, and it's estimated that the diminishing yields will hit 500 million small farms the hardest. And to add to the uncertainty, new research by Kew Gardens tells us that 4 billion people rely entirely on just 3 crops: rice, maize, and wheat. And we know that farmers are on the front line. They are often the first to feel the negative impacts of climate change and nature loss. And they're also the hardest hit. So reconciling food production with nature, I think, is one of the greatest challenges that we face today. Simply that we cannot hope to provide sufficient food for a growing population unless we learn to do so in a way that supports nature. At the same time, we cannot hope to protect natural ecosystems without radically reforming land use. So we urgently need a land use revolution to match the revolution that we're seeing in clean technology. And the good news, as this report shows, is that we broadly know what needs to be done. And in many respects, it doesn't require us to completely reinvent the wheel. More than a decade ago, the UN FAO and the World Bank issued a joint report on food security and agriculture. And I want to quote directly from it. "The status quo today is no longer an option," it said. "We must develop agriculture that is less dependent on fossil fuels, favors the use of locally available resources, and explores use of natural processes like crop rotation and use of organic fertilizers." Now, it was quite a statement coming from those organizations back then. And what led them to make it was the discovery that all around the world, the evidence suggests that even while small-scale, diverse farms are less productive per unit of labor, they are more labor-intensive, clearly, they are often more productive per unit of land. Not always, but often. We know that a global shift to more sustainable farming practices could pay dividends for food production, for water security, biodiversity, and addressing climate change. And clearly, there is a big role and responsibility for governments. They have the ability both to invest directly and to shape the incentives that drive agriculture. The OECD, for instance, estimates that the top 51 food-producing countries provide around $700 billion a year in public support to agricultural producers, and the vast majority of that is driving harmful practices. Coincidentally, scientists have estimated that we need to mobilize around $700 billion per year to reverse environmental destruction and to put nature on a path to recovery. So changing the way governments incentivize land use is a prerequisite not only to reversing nature loss, but to tackling climate change and feeding a growing human population as well. In the UK, we are introducing a new environmental land management scheme, and that will shift public support away from harmful land use practices to reward farmers for delivering on environmental benefits. As part of our COP26 campaign, we are determined to build a global coalition of ambitious countries committed to doing similarly and to achieving a just rural transition to sustainability around the world. At the end of September, the world gathered virtually for the UN General Assembly, and at that summit, more than 75 world leaders signed up to an ambitious, radical even, leaders' pledge for nature. It included a commitment to put nature and biodiversity on a road to recovery by 2030, and I'm proud that the UK played a critical role in strengthening that pledge, insisting on the strongest possible language. But the challenge now, of course, is to turn those words into action, both at home and around the world. And with all 3 Rio conventions meeting next year for the first time ever, 2021 is clearly the moment to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Goldsmith. He wasn't able to join us live, but thank you for making that video and sending it over to us. So that's the global perspective, the big vision. But how can that work on the ground in an individual country? Well, one of the most inspirational examples that we can share with you today has to be in Andhra Pradesh, which has become the first state in India to set up a Department of Natural Farming, headed up by Dr. Vijay Kumar. Now, he's pioneered a low-input, chemical-free, agroecological system called zero budget, natural farming. Get that in your head. You'll be hearing that a lot in the next 5 minutes. And 1 million farmers across Andhra Pradesh have either converted or are in the process of converting their land to zero budget natural farming. So it's quite an achievement. And Dr. Kumar's vision is to convert all 6 million farmers in the state to that system. But how? How is he getting so many farmers to trust and adopt these methods? Well, hopefully he's going to share the secret with us now. Over to you, Dr. Kumar.
Thank you, Anna. So, 5 minutes is too short a time to share such secrets, but I'll make an attempt. Distinguished panelists, it's really a privilege to be part of this dialogue, a very important dialogue. And as Anna pointed out, this year our target is to enroll 1 million farmers and farm workers. Farm workers to be left behind. And 86% of these are small and marginal farmers. That means less than 2 hectare holding. And they're also around 50% are semi-literate and illiterate. So this is the group of farmers. The only secret, Anna, if it has to be mentioned in one sentence, is my belief in the farmers. So according to me, farmers are gods. If we propitiate them appropriately, then this transformation will happen. So I believe in them very strongly. And the farmers who are with us on this journey, 700,000 of them last year, have realized livelihoods, good for resilience, and also good for their own health. And they also know that their consumers are happy with this food. And they also are seeing that there is more biodiversity, more earthworms, more pollinators, more birds. So I don't really see any conflict. I think nature and humanity, we have to go together. I mean, nature doesn't need us; we need nature. So we have to be more careful. And in our approach, absolutely no chemicals, no chemical fertilizers, no pesticides, no herbicides, no weedicides. Our farmers realize that the critical factor is the soil biology below the ground. Now, the question is, and also please remember, this transformation is happening without any subsidies to farmers. So there is no particular financial incentive saying that if you are a farmer in this transition, you'll get X amount of money. No. So there are no boundary conditions have not changed. And that is what is the importance of this transformation. But what is happening is that worldwide, in spite of the knowledge that we have, that this is good for farmers, environment, human beings, it's not scaling up. And as Anna, put it, what is the secret behind scaling up? So I just want to focus the remaining time that I have on this. The first and foremost reason is ours is a farmer-centered approach. So it is the farmers themselves, best practicing farmers, who are taking this knowledge to other farmers. But this requires, we know that a farmer takes 3 to 5 years for this transition. So to help in this transition, we have a network of women self-help groups. And in our state, 90% of rural women are organized into self-help groups and their federations. So it is the women who are playing an important role of hand-holding of the farmers for the transition. The other thing is, we believe, even though I'm a government organization, we work like a non-governmental organization. We believe that our role is to get out of the way. Our role is to ensure that the champion farmers and the women self-help group, this process of transformation is helped by whichever way that we can. And of course, we also have a lot of collaborations with the global institutions for science and technology, for validation, etc. I also have a very important innovation. We have a 365 days green cover approach. That means a farmer keeps the land under crops throughout the year. So this, in fact, is reducing the land that is required for agriculture. So today we have 6 million hectares of land, and if this approach can continue, we can actually effectively make it into 12 to 15 million hectares of land. So we can set aside more land for forests, more land for conservation. We also have 3 million hectares of fallow land. If I can bring that back to life and put it mostly under a forest cover, so with a lesser amount of land, would have achieved food and nutrition security, health, and also would have created a forest, a food forest. So I believe that it is a win-win-win. I also have one point to say about the report. The report has mentioned there are a lot of barriers to scaling up, but I want to offer a very unconventional approach. I want to suggest that these barriers will not go away like it's not as if somebody waves a magic wand and the barriers go away. For the barriers to go away, there will be another 30 years of these consultations. I think the time has come to see where scaling up has happened in spite of these barriers. Our example shows that we didn't wait for any of these policies to change. We decided we should go ahead. And once we achieved a scale, the barriers started melting. And once the barriers melt, it accelerates my process. So I think we have to find a disruptive way of moving. Have various COPs every year, but there'll be a lot of time in discussions. Things may not happen on ground. I'll conclude here, Anna, because my time is up. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Dr. Kumar. Thank you very much. And my dad, who is a farmer, would be overjoyed to hear himself called a god. So I'll pass that on to him. Yeah, wonderful message there about barriers melting away once we take action. We've heard a global vision, and we've heard how it can be applied on the ground in one country. But how do we upscale this into a worldwide system? How can a post-COVID green recovery be applied to a myriad of different farmed landscapes all over the world? Big question. Our third speaker is Dr. Leonard Mitzi. He is Head of Rural Development, Food Security and Nutrition at DEFCO. Now, DEFCO is the department that deals with international aid and development at the European Commission. And he's speaking today on behalf of Deputy Director General of DEFCO, Mariette Jager. So over to you, Dr. Mitzi.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you to IUCN. My excuses on behalf of Marietta, who couldn't join us. We are in a critical moment on programming, and one of our delivery modes is actually to work more in a landscape approach. I come from the agriculture and food systems part of the house, and to engage more and more with our colleagues in environment and in climate change. I think the words of Siri and of the minister is clear. I would take one core message. Status quo is not sustainable. Business as usual needs to actually be rethought, because not only because of COVID and the pandemic, but actually in the context of next year's events. We have COP, we have CBD, we have the UN Food System Summit. I think there has to be a process of parallelism so that the various parts of the processes start communicating to each other. So I thank IUCN for organizing this event, the participants, around 90. And it's for us a very important moment, the unveiling contribution to building science-based approaches to the challenges we face today. Your report is actually music to our ears, also because it's important to start connecting the dots between what we do around agricultural food systems, what we do around conservation, around biodiversity, and what we do in terms of climate change. It is timely because the European Union, as I said, is preparing its programming for the period 21-2027. We exit the programming period 2014-2020, and we are now in what is known as programming phase until the period up to 2027. So we fully recognize that action on biodiversity, on food security, on nutrition, on climate change is essential for sustainable development. Action in these areas helps to reduce inequalities, especially in this time of COVID, where it's evident that there will be shocks in a post-COVID recovery, shocks that we are already feeling today in terms of the inequalities of global value chains and in terms of the transmission of these shocks in different parts from indigenous communities to various operators, including small farm holders and fisher folk. So the Green Deal is clearly our entry point, and implementing the EU Green Deal means implementing strategies on biodiversity, on agri-food systems, and they need to go hand in hand. In fact, actually, these two documents were unveiled earlier on this year, and Council conclusions, for example, on farm to fork, were concluded with the Agriculture and Fisheries Minister a few weeks ago. The Green Deal is our new growth strategy. It is also our plan for a stronger recovery from the pandemic. It is a transformative agenda for a green, a fairer, and a just recovery, and several strategies back the Green Deal, from the climate change, from the environment, and from the circular economy. I just want to start with the EU biodiversity strategy. This is a clear roadmap for action in the EU and beyond its borders. It demonstrates a strong commitment to integrate protection of biodiversity at bilateral and multilateral level. And the farm to fork strategy, which aims an acceleration and the widening of our transition to sustainable food systems. This should also have a positive environmental impact, as it will help mitigate climate change and adapt to its impacts. It will reverse the loss of biodiversity and ensure food security, nutrition, and public health. Our approach to the planetary emergency facing us is an integrated one. The European Union is convinced that biodiversity conservation and reconstruction are intrinsically linked to the sustainable food systems. And both are mutually dependent, as one always feeds the other. Conservation and agriculture are the common ground for a healthier and more equitable world. Biodiversity. Halting biodiversity loss is at the center of the specific programs that the European Union runs and that are dedicated to conservation and restoration of fragile ecosystems, including activities for fighting wildlife trafficking. Biodiversity will also be further mainstreamed and combined with our overarching policies to support human rights, gender equality, health, education, just to name a few. Food systems. On food systems, clearly our approach will become more encouraging and developing agroecological approaches. Siri mentioned this. In fact, within my own unit, I am in charge of an agricultural portfolio for the period 2018-2020 of around 300 million euros, which actually looks into agroecology scaling up across the globe, focusing on the Sahel, focusing also on parts of Latin America and on the Horn of Africa. Although based on a set of principles that are applicable and understandable worldwide, agroecological practices are really designed to be implemented by tailoring to local context and local needs. Essentially, the goal is to allow communities to understand and to determine how to nurture agroeconomic systems themselves. With healthier agroeconomic systems, there will be greater biodiversity, better quality food, diverse diets, and varied production. This means healthier planet and more resilient populations. I give two examples that we have been unveiling in the past months. First of all, landscape approaches, which serve to better integrate production, biodiversity, conservation, and climate change. As we move forward, close to 50 EU delegations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are working in the field with European Union member states and have identified landscape actions which will be a priority for new future programming. Second example,
Dr. Michi, I just have to hurry you very quickly. Sorry, I'm just going to have to hurry you. 30 seconds. Thank you.
Yes, and the Natura Africa, which aims to tackle biodiversity loss by creating network for protected areas and corridors safeguarding wildlife. So actually, just to conclude, the EU Green Deal, the programming, the Team Europe initiatives across the globe will evidently deliver on the landscape approaches, and your report really will be food for thought, which we will also communicate to our delegations at this critical moment. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitzi. And sorry to jump in, we have so much to get through, but you covered an extraordinarily huge amount of topics in there, so thank you. We have heard from 3 fantastic speakers advocating a massive shift in the global farming system. But the path to change is never easy. There are many competing interests to consider, which don't always agree, as we know. But the point of this event is finding the common ground that unites us all so that we can move forward in a positive way. Now, we have a panel discussion coming up. They will share their views in just a moment. But first, I would like to invite Stuart McGuinness. He is Global Director of IUCN's Nature-Based Solutions Group, and he's going to provide some really key context for this discussion. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Anna. And could I ask the organisers just to beam up the presentation? So thanks very much, and I'm delighted to be part of this event. I think we've heard 3 really inspirational perspectives to start with. So my job is over the next 10 minutes or so to really try and do a little bit of scene setting, drawing from the Common Ground report. Now, just to start off, and before I jump into the details, I'll just declare an interest here that I'm very vested in this, not only professionally, but also personally. And I've always actually felt a discomfort in the antagonism associated between the conventional agriculture and conservation narrative, for reasons I'll explain in 2 minutes. And part of that is really because I empathize with both sides. I come from a farming background. I grew up working on small mixed farms, and my grandparents, several uncles, we ourselves had a small poultry unit. And my first degree was in agriculture. And I spent the first 15 years of my professional life working with small-scale farmers in East Africa, West Africa, and Central America. And I actually I should add, being educated by them. So in a nutshell, farming people are my people, and coming from a farming background has shaped who I am. I'm actually very proud of that. At the same stage, I've also spent the majority of my life, my professional life, working in conservation, working to safeguard biodiversity. And it's clear that several of the pressures that drive biodiversity loss come from some types of farming systems, and that loss has been significant in some areas, and in terms of both biodiversity and species and key ecosystem services. However, I feel, and I think there's actually many of you on this webinar today probably also share this conviction that there is real common ground to explore, real synergies to be able to tap into, and that it's not only possible that farming and farming systems coexist with conservation, but they can mutually support each other. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to try and do now over the next few minutes is really try and frame some quite big and complex issues into a couple of simple narratives. So I would appreciate that these are not straightforward, but I would ask you to bear with me in trying to sort of focus on trying to tease out a couple of messages from the bigger picture. I'm going to start actually by recapping what farmers and agriculture have achieved. And you'll see there on the slide, I talk about 60 years of agricultural intensification. Now, I will highlight that is not intended as a pejorative statement. It's actually, it recognizes what has been delivered. And we've heard Lord Goldsmith mention some of that already, that global agriculture has meant that we're food secure. When I studied agriculture in the early 1980s, I remember being told that the world produced 110% of the calorific need of the global population at that time. That figure's barely shifted. It's approximately about 107, 108% at the minute. And that means that food production has kept pace with global population growth. Importantly, I think this is very, very important, that hunger and malnutrition has been reduced by 2/3. In the 1960s, 1 in 3 global citizens were food insecure, went hungry. Now it is 1 in 10. Now that is still far too much, but I think it shows that there is no productivity constraint to prevent us from eliminating this rather immoral specter of people going hungry. And while this growth, and we've mentioned this, has driven biodiversity loss and clearance of forests and wetlands, I think it's also important to reflect that it is not as much as could have otherwise been the case. There's been a 300% increase in food productivity. The area of agricultural land has expanded by 10%. Now, these efficiency gains have really actually meant that we've been able to feed more on less land. In the 1990s, an increase in the FAO's food productivity index came at the expense of about 5 million hectares of forests. By 2014, that same incremental increase required about 1 million hectares. Still too much, no one argues about that there, but I think you can actually see that agriculture, and indeed agricultural intensification, has arguably spared some land that may have otherwise been converted into away from natural habitats. But, and this has been highlighted several times, there is a cost, and this cost has been in terms of production systems that are wasteful. I want to highlight the fact that farmers continue to operate on extremely tight margins, which constrains farm incomes, and critically, the quality of agricultural land on average has eroded and degraded. So conventional rates of erosion on agricultural land are 1 to 2 orders of magnitude greater than than background erosion. And at least 1/4, maybe up to 1/2 of land is degraded or degrading. That's not just a threat to biodiversity, that's also undermines the agricultural systems we rely on. Next slide, please. So very quickly, coming then to this idea of building. Well, how do we build this common ground where we can start to have a constructive and mutually supportive dialogue and critically action? And I would say that it starts by a focus on land health. That land health is determined in turn by soil and soil biodiversity, and this determines the productivity of above ground production. It enhances biodiversity. It makes major contributions to water supply and water quality downstream, and it contributes critically to climate change. So there is a real link between soil biodiversity, land productivity, carbon sequestration on the soil, and the provision of goods and services. And we already know there are several practices that really can drive this sort of outcome. And we've heard from Dr. Kumar on one in Andhra Pradesh. There's also zero tillage, agroforestry, etc. Next slide, please. Just a few words on soil biodiversity, because I personally think soil biodiversity is cool and sexy and exciting. And sadly, it's completely overlooked, including actually by conservationists. And if we look at, and while these taxonomic groups that include invertebrates, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, lichens, may not be as photogenic as a panda or a whale, they do underpin the key aspects of our life and our well-being. Just very quickly, on a handful of soil, there are 12,000 species and 50 kilometers of fungal filaments. The vast majority of these are microfungi, which are too small to see with the human eye, but are the engines of our system. And then actually, when you add all that up, that equates to 5 tons of living matter per hectare. So soil biodiversity and building soil biodiversity, I would argue, is a real common interest for both farming community and for conservationists. Next slide, please. That is good practice, and building soil is of course important, but it's not enough. And I think I just want to make a couple of words here on this. Has to actually translate into better incomes for farmers. We've got to ensure that sustainable agriculture fits into a responsive value chain, because we can put in place all the good practices we want, but if retailers keep passing on price cuts that they make to consumers onto farmers, or farmers are undermined by cheap, subsidized or unregulated imports coming in that undermine their sustainable productions, then it is going to make these challenges all the more important. So as conservationists and as well, I think we've got to have a real interest in how these supply chains work and how these value chains work, and that ensuring that this actually ends up in rewarding farmers and enhancing farm income. Next slide, please. And where can we look for that? Well, we've already heard several quite inspiring examples, and we've heard Lord Goldsmith say that the UK really wants to drive this. But I think the other thing is we've got to look at actually some of the other benefits as well. We've got improved sustained productivity, but also if you look at the massive contributions that, let's say, for example, enhanced soil carbon through better soil biodiversity can make for climate change, or make in terms of water retention, and indeed flooding control. All these benefits are being provided free, by and large at the minute, by the farming community. Next slide, please. So in summary, I want to highlight 3 areas that I think we as conservationists and farming and farmers and those interested in agriculture can build a common ground narrative. One is how we really get supportive policy frameworks that optimize this balance between land productivity and land health. I agree with Dr. Kumar. Sometimes we want to be disruptive. We want to see where things are already happening. At other times, we want to build with the momentum that's already going and actually see how that can work through. And we know there are lots of governments that are now interested. Second is, I think, a real commitment to build back soil and soil biodiversity. And that will require both farmers and conservationists working together. Conservationists need to fill several knowledge gaps on this taxonomic mixes that actually do that. And finally, we can talk about practice, we can talk about policy, but we've also got to make sure that the economics work and that farm incomes are reflective of the investments that farmers make into sustainable practices. Just to conclude then, I'd like to leave sort of three questions for you to reflect. Next slide, please. About next steps for building common ground. Number one, what do you think are policies and investments that could really have a significant impact in optimizing this land productivity and land health? How best can we build consensus on what are the important multiple benefits that need to be delivered from sustainable agriculture? And critically then, what mechanisms are available that can reward this delivery of multiple benefits and tangibly enhance farm incomes from sustainable agriculture? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was a fantastic overview that tees up our panel discussion, which we're heading into now. So thank you very much indeed. Now, before we can truly throw ourselves into finding the way forward, it's important to acknowledge the past and really understand the situation that we find ourselves in globally now and how we've got here. So I'm going to ask each of our 4 panelists to talk for 1 minute, no longer, on what they believe have been the biggest barriers between agriculture and conservation. What, in their view, may have got in the way of a constructive dialogue between farmers and the wider farming industry, and conservationists and environmental groups. Now, we don't want to dwell on this too long, which is why we're going to have the 60-second timer come up, so we will know exactly when it's time to stop talking. First up, we have Ilojilo Obiemi, who is the founder of Youth for the Environment in Nigeria. Ilojilo, kick us off with your 1-minute answer.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Happy to be here. So, of course, one major barrier that I would say is limiting the adoption of best practices, addressing the mutual exclusivity between farming and conservation is the fact that, these wild assumptions that the knowledge and potentials, of the best practices of sustainable agriculture and associated practices, that this knowledge gets to concern stakeholders who are at the community level once it is published in papers, online, and also discussed in conferences and workshops. The place of local dialogues, bringing together this farming and the farmer community and the conservationists now together on a platform, that is facilitated by trusted voices who has a clear understanding of what is obtainable at the grassroots level. And who has a direct connection to the grassroots is no longer there, and as such, our farmers are excluded and exempted from this discussion as to why they need to adopt and what are the potentials therein in adopting these best practices. And of course,
out of time. You're out of time, but you made it. You got there. I got that point. Farmers haven't had the platform. They need to share that platform with conservationists. Really great. Moving on now. Thank you, Ilojilo. Next up is Esther Puninia. Esther is Secretary General of the Asia Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development, which represents 13 million farmers in 16 countries across Asia. Over to you, Esther. What have been the biggest barriers between agriculture and conservation?
Thank you very much, Anna. I can think of 4 biggest barriers which are interconnected with each other. First is the current paradigm, the mindset of agriculture, where the objective of agriculture is solely to provide food, fuel, and fiber, and to provide huge profits to a few big investors. So no matter what the cost, no matter what happens to the environment and the ecosystem. Second is absence or lack or conflicting policies, especially at the country level. Like in Philippines, where we have a National Organic Agriculture Act, but we are supporting GMO corn and GMO rice and chemical farming through subsidies and incentives. Third is the absence or lack of support in terms of finances, in capacity building, in disseminating all the innovations and experiments that are already there for agriculture that does conservation too. Financing, especially in terms of supporting farmers' decision to transition to agroecological approaches. And lastly is the mindset that the farmer is mere recipient of technologies, or worse, is the problem in agriculture rather than a key agent and a solution provider. Thus, we are unable to harness the potentials of millions of family farmers in agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you very much. A lot of information packed into a minute there. Next up, we have Professor Pablo Titanel, an agronomist, an ecologist, and chair of the Resilient Landscapes for Nature and People group at Groningen University in the Netherlands. Dr. Pablo, over to you.
I mute myself. Hi, good afternoon. Well, I could say that when we think about the Green Revolution, the revolution that raised those yields, as we saw in the pictures that were showed previously, was based on applying the principles of industries to agriculture. So simplifying the system to make it work in one direction, simplifying the ecosystem, taking an industrial approach to it. Now, in an industry, you have machines that you can replace. A machine gets an input that produces an output, and we thought that the soil would be the same as a machine. But unfortunately, we cannot replace the soil. The soil gets degraded, and we need to keep on working with that soil. And one of the things that is lost is biodiversity in those soils, the huge amount of biodiversity that we don't see. So we lose functions. So I think nowadays we realize that that is a problem, because nature is not only working for conserving wildlife and things like those, which are all like, but also to produce food. farmers can work for nature, but nature can also work for farmers. I think that's an important issue that we need to think about from now on.
Thank you very much. So really, soil has been a barrier in the sense that we have not really understood it properly. So that has been a barrier between the two. Very interesting thoughts. Next, our fourth and final panelist is Florence Janté. She is Managing Director of One Planet Business for Biodiversity. Now, this is a coalition of 20 big private companies who are working together to increase biodiversity in agricultural supply chains. Florence also works for Danone, has worked for Unilever, so brings that vital business perspective to what we're discussing today. So that question, that 1 minute answer question to you, Florence, what have been the biggest barriers between an effective dialogue between agriculture and conservation?
Hello, thank you very much for this talk and discussion. I think the biggest barrier was, in fact, there was no discussion. It has been two worlds living in parallel with different objectives, as many of the panelists already said here. So where is the opportunity in front of us is actually to start aligning the fact that we have one planet for all the objectives on environment, feeding the world, and getting all the activities that we need to get an healthy society. So two worlds, two objectives cannot make it happen. And so far, it has been also a lot of lack of trust, fight, ignorance. So it's the time to build action, to rebuild this trust, and hopefully very soon. And to finally, the initiatives, and for the first time, having IUCN talking about agriculture and publishing a report is actually a first key milestone to inspire all of us, wherever we are in the value chain.
Thank you very much, and bang on time. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you all of you for sticking to time on that really important question. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about that common ground and finding that positive way forward. There will be some time for questions at the end. I'd like to stick with you, Florence, particularly as you raised the issue of trust there in your answer. We've heard a lot about getting farmers to transition to these natural farming systems. But is the market demand out there? Because at the moment, as consumers, we can choose between organic and conventional, and that's a very easy concept to understand. It's a very clear choice. Agroecology sits somewhere in the middle. This is a sort of new grey area. Is there a proven market for it? And could you give us an example?
There is clearly emerging demand from the consumers on having and understanding where the food they buy, the clothes they buy come from. So the demand is clearly emerging. There is some examples, and I think the best example we have so far on this kind of emerging market has been the organic market, which has been transforming a part of the agriculture. Now it's about scaling up and more widely beyond the concept of organic. And what we are within OP2B organization supporting is the scale up of the regenerative agriculture, which will be bigger and hopefully able to scale and answering the demand of the consumers that are emerging.
And I just wanted to pick up with you quickly on that issue of trust that came up earlier. You have acknowledged yourself that the transition to this biodiverse future is going to be expensive, and those at the highest risk will be the farmers. Now, we know that farmers have always been price takers. They have never been price makers. That has led to deep distrust in agricultural supply chains. Who will pay for this biodiverse transition, and who will profit from it? So who's going to pay and who's going to profit? Quickly to you.
I think who is paying today for the world in which we are living? I can reframe the discussion. So I think we have to reframe the discussion and consider the full value chain again and the true value of food. This cannot be done by just minor adjustments of any single part of the chain. It needs to be about rethinking the different values. It needs to be about thinking that and acknowledging and paying for the fact that the farmers are producing and selling much more than just what the industry or us as a citizen are paying for, which is the food. It's about also on all the economic services, societal services that they are providing. And one of them could be to start to acknowledge that we need to value the CO2 sequestration that this change in agriculture can provide, which will be a first recognition that is an additional value created by the farmers on the land, that the society is beneficial through the CO2 sequestration, meaning the climate. But it's going beyond. We have been talking about decreasing of the pollution, which means better water, better air that we are breathing all together. And it's about also the conservation of some wild species, which means providing a positive pollination, for instance, which is a service that the nature gives back to the farmers. So it's about rethinking the way we are looking at the chain and the way also we incentivize the different part of the chain to get into this discussion. So we are really looking for also the way we evaluate within the companies and we assess the companies on what they do positively or negatively to contribute to this journey.
I wanted Florence to introduce the idea of value chain so that I could then move on to Esther, because I'd be very interested to hear, Esther, how you would respond to that. You have spoken very passionately about giving farmers more power in value chains, better prices, basically. Do you think a better price for what they produce will directly impact their chances of transitioning to different and more sustainable farming practices? Esther, please.
Yes, thank you, Anna, for that question. Indeed, if farmers have better prices for their products, and if agroecologically produced products have premium prices, then it will incentivize the farmers to transition into agroecology or sustainable farming practices. But prices will not be sufficient, no? Especially in transitioning, we need support to transition from chemical farming to a sustainable or agroecological approach, because in the first 2 to 3 years we know that we will lose. So who will pay for that? So that's why we need like incentives to shift, and also some support and some technology also, like how to shift and how to transition. Now we know that, for example, we cannot go all out 100%. We should transition little by little. Like if we have 1 hectare farm, let 1/4 hectare be done with organic farming, and then later on 1/2 until we go into 100. And also farmers organizations will be a key for the price, because an individual farmer who do organic farming may have increased price, but it will be a bigger organization who could negotiate for a bigger price for their products that has been produced sustainably. That's why we promote the cooperatives of family farmers. They do sustainable production, they do sustainable processing, but the capacity of the organizations, leaders and members are built so that they can negotiate with the price, they can negotiate with any contract or partnership agreement that they will enter into with other companies or other buyers.
Okay, so coming together in that cooperative model is what creates that market power. Just sticking with you very, very briefly, most of the farmers that you work with are using fertilizers or pesticides to an extent. How do they respond to the agroecological techniques that you are promoting? On their list of priorities, is it high or low? Because they have many other things to worry about. We've seen terrible typhoon ripping through the Philippines only in the last couple of weeks. So when you talk to farmers about these practices, is it a high priority for them or a low priority?
It is a very high priority, especially when they see the interconnections of the environment, how taking care of the environment, and having increased yields and increased incomes. For the fishers, for example, we have our fishers, for example, have practiced illegal fishing, dynamite fishing, which brings them instant fish harvest, but they know that, but now they know that it destroys coral reefs and the homes of the fishes. So they need to do sustainable fisheries. So that awareness, when they are aware, that is key. But awareness is not enough. No, there must be support to sustainable fishing, farming, forestry, in terms of the incentives, in terms of the capacity building, technology, information, support to prices, capacity building, even awards for good harvest. These are all important to be able to stick, for farmers to stick to sustainable agriculture. We have had experience with farmers of doing organic rice production. They did not get good price for their organic production, and the government was incentivizing chemical farming through free pesticide, free fertilizer. So they went back. They went back. But those farmers who are organized into cooperatives of organic rice production, they stick. No, because as an organization, they were able to get markets, like a department store, who will pay higher price for their organic rice.
Thank you very much, Esther. So it's less about telling them that these things work and preaching, it's more about the farmers discovering the evidence for themselves, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating, I suppose, is the point that you're making. Thank you very much. Dr. Pablo Titinel, one of the most fascinating statistics that came out of the IUCN Common Ground report is that 95% of the organisms that live in our soil are unidentified. We know nothing about them. So my question to you as an agronomist is that an opportunity, you know, sending us off on a voyage of discovery, or is it a threat? Because we know people can feel very overwhelmed and unmotivated when they don't understand something and something is very difficult to grasp. So a threat or an opportunity that we know so little about our soils?
Well, I think it's an opportunity that to know that we are new techniques. We're starting to scratch the surface of all this complexity that's in there in the soil and getting to understand it. But it doesn't mean that we need to understand everything before you know how to manage it properly. You know, you can. I mean, farmers and farmers in all the range of scales have been managing soils in many parts of the world in a sustainable way without necessarily knowing about all that diversity, right? Or they had the intuition that it was there, but they didn't know that you could extract them, their DNA and things like those. So I think in that sense, it's an opportunity to know more. I mean, and we are interested in bringing and solving some trade-offs that were mentioned earlier between, for example, cooling the climate, producing food, maintaining biodiversity. And we think that in that diversity in the soil, we can find the key to actually find ways to bring those into synergy more than trade-offs. But if you allow me, I'd like to go back to something that was said previously, because Jeanette said something, Florence said something very interesting about the prices and the costs. And I think the idea of true pricing in a value chain it can be an important contribution to bringing these worlds together, because true pricing means true cost accounting and true value assignment. You know, so we have a lot of hidden costs, which we're not paying for them in the price we pay for food, right? So there is a lot of environmental damage that goes there somewhere. Somebody pays for that, but we as consumers, we don't. And that can be in your neighborhood, it can be somewhere around the world, right? And the same is with the price we pay and the value the food has. You know, the value in terms of what we get as calories and vitamins and everything else, but also the value in terms of contributing to ecosystem services. So I think if we work on those ends on a value chain, we can make a fairer value chain with a better distribution of wealth along the chain.
If we were to achieve the dream that you describe, which is moving global agriculture to this new agroecological system and make that the new baseline, the new conventional, if you like, say, you know, Esther's 13 million farmers all transitioned into producing organic rice. Is there enough consumers out there that can afford to pay that higher price? Because you're right, there are hidden costs. But can consumers, many of whom are on terribly low incomes, can they afford to pay those costs?
I didn't, that was not a word I was describing a dream, but why not? For example, I can tell you an example from where I'm from, actually, which is Argentina, not the Netherlands, which is called the Unión de Trabajadores de la Tierra, UTT, Land Laborers Union, which is an organization that started very small, some 10 years ago, with this business model, the idea of producing healthy food for the poorest people, right? And producing with landless farmers, with landless people. So they started, you know, lobbying and getting land from municipal governments, and they started training people to produce in an agroecological way, and they produce at low cost, very healthy food, and they sell it in the city or online or in different ways, and they sell it cheaply, and they address the poorest of the poorest. And of course, this is a non-profit organization, right? So the profit there is shared between the farmers and the people who benefit from paying less. But I mean, these sort of social enterprises are also possible, you know. And of course, this will not be necessarily, you know, a model for the current food system, but but we can think about alternatives. An alternative that I like a lot is the example of what's going on with the electric cars nowadays. You know, it's a whole transformation in the industry. Not only the technologies, but also the way it is commercialized. It is, I mean, they are very expensive, yes, but people are leasing cars. You know, there are all innovations in terms of how people access their cars. So in the end, and you know, for that to happen, you have always one or two innovators which are spearheading, and then the rest of the industry follows. So I think what Florence was saying, you know, if we can have these innovators in the industry that are marking the pace and taking the direction, I don't see that as a dream, honestly. I think that it can happen.
We've seen a big announcement this week in the UK, sort of banning the sale of all new diesel and petrol cars by 2030, bringing it forward 10 years instead of 2040. So
if you ask the oil companies to actually come up with that idea, they will never, right?
Absolutely.
So it doesn't necessarily come from inside. You need other pressure groups to actually move the whole thing forward.
And the reason I refer to it as a dream still is that we do an awful lot of talking about what is supposed to happen. And many young people feel frustrated about the amount of talking. They want to see more action. And a man who embodies that call is Ilojilo Opiemi. He is ready for action. He's had enough talk and has already planted nearly 4,000 trees across Nigeria. He runs workshops for farmers, I think over Zoom during the COVID era, teaching them how to make organic fertilizers. This is a young person who has really mobilized other young people to stop talking and get acting. So Ilojilo, how have you done that in Nigeria, and how can we scale that up globally to get people moving beyond the talking into the acting so that we can make the dream a reality?
Thank you again, Hannah. For me, I believe it's about creating the enabling environment to allow for these people to engage. You know, in Nigeria, you know, for me, it's about identifying what young people really want, what people really want, and the change we need to effect in the environment. Then create a nexus between these two spaces. For one, in the aspect of mobilizing young people to act now, I understand that, okay, young people appreciate when they have certificate of participation, when they have people to recommend them for one other opportunity that they want to engage in like that. And I want them to engage in climate and conservation and agroecological space in Nigeria. So I get them engaged and then have this certificate and recommendation as incentives for them. And another thing, I understand that young people want to eat, they need money in their pocket. But then I can just call them to engage in climate and conservation action without meeting these needs. So I talked about how about building their capacity on green businesses space, something that will not only deliver money to their pocket, but also contribute to the climate and conservation action. And so we promote this engagement. So like I mentioned, it's about, for one, creating the enabling environment, and also making the resources available for them to engage in this space. and building the capacity appropriately, and then finding the nexus between what it is people really want and then the change that we need to effect in the environment, then create a platform that unites and brings solutions to it. Yeah.
Farming, agriculture worldwide, in many parts of the world, is an aging profession, Ilijilo. Attracting young people into food production is a little bit harder than attracting young people to the climate cause in a way. You know, we have seen members of Extinction Rebellion and other climate activist groups are young people, but in farming, very often that isn't replicated. They are much older. From what you're seeing in Nigeria, could this new model for agriculture using nature-based solutions, could that be a little bit sexier and more attractive for young people to bring them back from the cities and back to the land?
Yes, thank you again. Yes, I believe so. I believe this is the agroecology as it is and has the potential to bring young people back to this space. You know, one thing about nature-based solutions like agroecology is the fact that it's able to deliver multiple benefits now. You know, not just repositioning us to the front line of climate action, but also supporting and enabling us to produce food, healthy food in an environment. And one thing that young people I know are passionate about is securing a livable future for us all, you know, where human and nature are able to coexist in harmony. And if agroecology as a nature-based solution is able to deliver on this, I believe it will be a major motivation and driver for young people to start coming back to this. And the knowledge of best practices on how to implement agroecology, if rightly implemented, would be able to, you know, bring, you know, incomes now, and then ensure that it reflects the investment. And if this is achievable and young people are taught on best practices on how to do this, I believe it will be a major motivation. But of course, the place of creating the enabling environment for young people to engage, as well as making resources available, incentives, you know, making it available for young people to engage in this space, I believe agroecology has the potential to bring people back to farming here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We are, apologies for me looking at my phone, but we are getting lots of questions coming in now from people watching. So a question for Esther. This comes from Barbara Adolf on Zoom, and it's a question regarding barriers. She says, farmers are not the problem, they are natural system thinkers, but often there are real disconnects at a national level, with agriculture and environment being dealt with in ministerial silos. That's a common criticism, isn't it? The two being very separate in terms of policy. What can be done about that, Esther?
Yes, that is very true. And with our problems on climate change and the environment, we need to think not in silos, but to think in an integrated, coordinated manner. There can be two options. One option is to form like one department. Like, for example, in some other countries, it's Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Forestry. So the whole ecosystem in agriculture is under one ministry. But and like, for example, in my country, it's Department of Agriculture and then Department of Forestry or Environment and Natural Resources. So that's first one, like kind of an integrated in one ministry. Or the second one is to establish like an interagency committee where you combine the three different ministries in a kind of a committee or cluster for coordination, monitoring, and making strategic directions. In the Philippines, for example, our government was trying to do that, like with the Department of Agrarian Reform, with the Department of Agriculture, and with the Department of Environment. So in terms of clustering the areas and where are the areas who would be producing such and such product based on the suitability of the soil, for example. So I think there will be several options to have an integrated and coordinated efforts at the national level.
Fantastic, Esther. Thank you very much. A question now to Florence. This has come again on Zoom. Where stands food prices in the equation? This is from Jan Yves Humbert. I'm sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, Jan. I think the question here is about keeping food affordable, Florence. This is something that Pablo addressed in his answer, but I wondered what your thoughts are on as we move to a transition in how we produce food, we're still keeping food affordable for the poorest in society. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on doing that at a big business level, a corporate level, as opposed to individual groups that are working at the grassroots. Over to you.
Thank you. This is a very important question because continuing to only innovate for the rich of this world will not work. So the full systems that we are rethinking, all of us need to be integrated, everyone, and not leave anyone behind. So if we are considering, and back to what Pablo was saying, considering here a new frame of the price of food and who is involved, as we've heard as well, there is an opportunity also to get more people, women, involved in the equation and get more revenue to start with. The price will have to the price is a matter of the distribution on the chain and how many people and what is the value of everyone is taking on the chain. And this change will not happen without rethinking the food and full value chain. Do we need to keep, and how do we get a distribution of the ingredients and the commodities different than the one we have today, which would mean different number of stakeholders and consequently potentially different value at the end, which will be paid by the consumer. So I'm talking about localization without going away, because that I think a too big dream and probably not necessary and not advisable even on the global trade. But there is, we have been to an extreme in global trade. Can we also rethink what can be done locally and get more local ingredients, more biodiversity, more agro-biodiversity, which then will be beneficial to the local population and quite often also people living on the ground, which are the poorest one, which is something which is a little bit crazy to think that in fact the farmers in many places are the ones who are the poorest also and not necessarily able to get access to the food and the quality and the quantity they would need. So we really need here to think and rethink about the full value chain. So it's a very complex topic, and the food industry cannot do it alone. It has, and I think this is the message that all of us are conveying, is about rethinking the value altogether, public, private, with support of government and incentives, and reassessing the value at each steps of the process.
Thank you, Florence. We could talk on that issue a lot, lots to be said. Very quickly though, question coming in for Pablo from Vivian Onyango on YouTube. So taking the 10 elements of agroecology, I hope you know what they are because I don't know all 10 of them. Are there prioritization criteria within those elements in support of a vibrant transition? So I think basically asking you, what is the most important aspect of our transition? Pablo.
Well, thanks, Vivian, for that question, because it allows me to say something more about agroecology. Because normally when we talk about agroecology, we talk about principles, which are, the principles of nature applied to farming, like efficiency, natural regulations, diversity, recycling, etc. But in agroecology is also a movement. And in agroecology, we also have social principles, which have to do with traditions and food values, shared knowledge, human values, equity, governance, etc. So those are as important as the natural principles. And I think the reason why she's asking that question is because I'm one of the authors of the FAO team that came up with this idea of the 10 principles that define agroecology, social and ecological principles. And yeah, of course, this prioritization of principles depends on the context where you are. If you are thinking of a transition in Nigeria, for example, or a transition in Indonesia, or a transition in Europe, I think we may have different starting points in that transition, and then we need to prioritize different principles. But the spirit of the idea of the principles is that they need to also build from the communities of farmers who are transitioning. So it doesn't really make sense for us to impose and say, well, this is the priority, these are the main ones, but it has to be a dialogue, because that's also part of agroecology, the dialogue and the co-construction of solutions.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Again, looking at the phone because it is hot here. There are so many questions coming through. Ilagilo, a question here for you regarding, we're hearing about the importance of farmer cooperatives supporting smallholder farming communities on the ground. How can we pair conservationists, young climate activists, people that are, active environmentalists? How can we match them up on the ground with farmers? How can we get them together? What would your thoughts be on that?
Well, again, I would speak to still creating that enabling environment for them to come together again. Each of these people now, they have their preferences for what they want to achieve from this now. So bringing them together to achieve that would require identifying what their preferences are, what it is that would encourage them coming together to achieve this. And one thing that is common to that is the climate action, climate change, which affects all these sectors now of the farming, conservation, as well as young people. So it's about approaching them at that point. What young people want to engage in climate action, secure the future, as well as make something out of it. Conservationists now want to say that nature is not degraded. They want to say that nature is still able to deliver on these ecosystem services, and farmers need to ensure that their income now reflects their investments. So it's about creating this enabling environment that provides all these answers, and then inviting people to come to this platform for dialogue, and then see how we can implement solutions.
I'm not sure what it's like in Nigeria, but just as we discussed policy being quite siloed at government levels, I think too the spirit of campaign and activism is quite siloed. When you see farmers getting together, they're often not in the same groups as environmentalists. The two are sometimes calling for the same thing, but in different silos. Are you managing to do you know lots of farmers? Are you talking to them every day?
Yeah, of course, definitely. So it's about again approaching it in a language that they would understand. You can go to a farmer and then start talking about climate change without linking it up to agriculture and how it affects agriculture, what they see happening to their farm in the everyday, and that's the only way they would listen to you when you want to speak about climate change. But talking about policy aspect of it, yeah, of course, farmers and young people are not always on this table of this decision-making process. That's why the adoption of these policies by farmers and conservationists is always a major problem, because they are not even there when the policies are being formulated, but taking it to them to serve as more of being enforced on them is always a major challenge. But having this platform of dialogue, two-way discussion, listening to them and speaking to them, but more importantly, listening to them is essential to really driving the adoption of the nexus between conservation and agriculture. Yeah.
So it's about adjusting the language as well. I think the youth is a really popular theme that's coming out of this panel. Another question for you, Ilagilo. So education often opposes agriculture and environment. Separate courses, separate diplomas. Competition between the two results in less and less agronomists and more ecologists. Ooh, interesting. Isn't it time to merge ecological and agronomist studies and education? I'm going to ask you that first, Ilagilo, but I'm also going to ask you that, Pablo, as well. What do you think, Ilagilo, on the education of our young agronomists and ecologists?
Well, I believe they should come together, and since one affects the other, and bringing together can really leads to achieving more results and then delivering graduates that are better versed and able to contribute to this change making in the society. But I think before this can take effect, we need to address the challenge of young people engaging in agriculture first, because at the end of the day, graduates might be produced without getting interested and engaging in agriculture space. Currently in Nigeria now, when you advise and encourage a young person, even the younger brother now, also start to go and opt for agriculture being an interest and necessary course. Now they think you don't like them because of the current realities with agriculture. So people prefer to go into environmental sciences, into ecology now, knowing that at least they get to contribute to the conservation effort, they get to contribute to climate action. But of course, we need more young people in the food production space. So of course, addressing the pull-up for young people to engage in agriculture is essential to ensuring that even when we bring together these courses at the education level now, it will still produce maximally the expected outcome.
Thank you, thank you. And over to you, Pablo. The universities and institutions you've worked at and studied at in Argentina and in the Netherlands, what do you think about merging agronomy and ecology?
Well, I think it's what Stella was explaining for the ministers is similar in the academia very often. I mean, in agronomy, classically, we are trained with the views of the Green Revolution, no? From the 70s, the idea of specialization. So if you're into plant pathology, or if you're into plant physiology, or into soils, or into animals, and we don't necessarily talk to all the disciplines. So agroecology proposes an integration of those. And I can tell you, I'm almost every month teaching a course somewhere in the world through Zoom now on agroecology, because there is a huge demand for that. And so there are many attempts to that. I mean, there are many. I was professor in Wageningen University in the Netherlands earlier, and we developed a program for that. Now I'm doing the same in Groningen. We did the same in Argentina. There are many in France as well. There are many places where this merge is happening. But I mean, it's important, as the person who was asking the question, I can't remember the name, was saying, it's important to keep the idea of the figure of the agronomists, because, very often people who are approaching agroecology from the social sciences, they're very good at understanding systems and communities and processes. But then farmers ask, what do I do now on my ground? And well, that's not my field. Ecologists, they are very good at understanding but then they don't have really the expertise to that. So I think agronomy has to be rescued from the past and renewed into a more integrative discipline that brings ecology, brings social scientists, and that is more up to date with what we need in these times.
Fantastic. That's one of the most interesting thoughts that's come out of today. Thank you very much. A final question now. Florence, this comes from Didier. He says, how are changes in diets being integrated into your scenarios for sustainable production in agriculture for feeding the world population? Changes in diets, I don't know, is the V word sort of lurking here? Veganism. It's I can't believe we've really finished this event and we've not mentioned veganism. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, the companies are not the one running the models, but what we are very clear on is that change of the diet and going for more vegetable protein will, of course, be a path and a necessary path to get back into the planetary boundaries that we have a role as a target to get back to. And it means for the companies, like the companies in OP2B, to start bringing innovation and biodiversity back in the offer and back into the portfolio that we are commercializing around the world. Because it will require, is not there as well, just a small adjustment, is to really invent a new product, healthy product, with a new, different raw materials to get the consumers buying it and being affordable, being healthy and affordable, back to the question before. And for that, it's a great point, because it means that we will have to we'll have to plant again some forgotten crops, or grow much better and at a much bigger volume, some local crops, which are currently shifting, unfortunately, to the 5 or 4 or 6 massive crops that are used everywhere. So it's an opportunity for conservation, it's an opportunity for agriculture, it's an opportunity for biodiversity. But it's a big challenge that we have to address all together. And yes, this is extremely important in all the, as far as I know, in all the models to get back to the target of 1.5 degrees.
Now we are going to squeeze in another question. We have got a couple of extra minutes, I've been told. So this is a question from Colin on YouTube, and I suppose it's a note of caution, and I'd like to hear some thoughts on this about the current time that we're in, you know, going through the global pandemic, the COVID-19 era. Many farmers have had real disruptions on their farms in the last few months and are having a very, very difficult time. Now, we always know that change can be costly. We know that change doesn't always bring everybody along, that there are losses and not everybody is up for this new world. The question from Colin is this the right time? Is it ethical to be forcing such change on farmers when they might be really struggling to keep their heads above water as it is? I think that's a really important question about the ethics of the timing. Pablo, you're nodding your head, so I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah, well, I mean, we just did a study. There's a global study going on, and I was in charge of the Latin American chapter on what were the implications of the COVID pandemics on food production, food security, food distribution, etc. But we also gave it a little bit of a twist to that question, and we said, well, what were the responses, especially of the informal sector? I mean, the family agriculture, the agroecology movement, not necessarily the governments, you know, the responses from bottom up. And then we found amazing things, you know, happening, and many people reconnecting with food, especially consumers, you know, and starting consuming in a different way. And that's also an entry point for what we are saying here, which is local, diverse, more vegetables, more fresh. Going for a fresh and more vegetable-based diet means also being more local, necessarily, right? So, and I think that the pandemic has opened a huge opportunity for a lot of farmers. So I don't share necessarily what the colleague is saying. I saw the opposite. I saw that a lot of farmers benefited from it. Of course, at the beginning, it was very, very difficult, but now they became independent. Instead of bringing their truck to the supermarket and getting the price whatever they can be their own actors and then sell themselves. So I think it creates a lot of opportunity and create new value chains, new employment. I think it's also an opportunity to rethink our food system now.
That's a really positive thought. And I know as a consumer myself, I've been buying a lot more local food, buying my milk direct from the farm, things like that, all since COVID. Esther, you speak to farmers every day. Tell us what they say to you. Have they got the energy for change? Are they feeling overwhelmed by it? What are they telling you?
We've got the energy for change, and we see this moment of COVID-19, and then still feeling the impacts of climate change. It's like we're having a lot of typhoons right now. So we see this as the opportune time to really call and press for changes, for transformations in our food systems. And the transformation is basically in making family farmers through their organizations be recognized as key agents. And then in production, in processing, and in marketing, that family farmers through their organizations are involved as key participants, and also in the governance process. Like, for example, they will decide on what to produce and how to produce and how to sell. This is the opportune time. Like Pablo has said, in many of our members, the COVID has brought opportunities to establish, for example, farmers markets, to establish direct relationships with the consumers. For example, in lockdown, urban poor associations, local farmers will go to them and sell their products there. The local food system is very much them in demand during COVID time. And this is how we think it should be. So if we would like to help our family farmers, our local farmers.
That's wonderful. Thank you all.
Can I add, Anna, on one point here, maybe, which is important, at least from the perspective we are saying, it's the opportunity also is extremely challenging for the farmers, that is what I said, but it's an opportunity to help them to get into a different model in which they will get the stewardship again. So what is painful is a transition, but there is better life for them by supporting them, all of us, to get into this world.
So what, if there is some...
because they will reduce what they buy, they will reduce the intrants, they will reduce the way they buy the seeds potentially also, and they will reduce, if we are making it right, what they buy from far away, because they will have a better and more qualitative production also to feed themselves and their family.
Well, it goes back to the name of Dr. Kumar's project in Andhra Pradesh, zero budget natural farming. This isn't going to cost you anything, but the benefits could be really great and seem to be really showing that they are working. So thank you very much, all of you. That was a fascinating panel discussion. We could go on all day, but unfortunately we haven't got all day, and I'm sure those of you at home haven't got all day to listen to us, as interesting as it is. I think the key messages that have really come out today has been this need to reconcile food production with nature. And we can't feed ourselves or fight climate change without nature. And we can't do it without farmers either. And, you know, listening to Dr. Kumar earlier describe farmers as gods. And if you believe in them, then we can make this journey together. So one thing that we all agree on is that farming and our natural environment are inextricably linked. They are intertwined. And it's a relationship going back 10,000 years. But it's only in the last 50 or so that this adversarial narrative has emerged, dividing team agriculture and team conservation. But a new era has begun. Regenerative agriculture, conservation farming, nature-based solutions, agroecology, zero-budget natural farming. What all these different names are talking about is bringing two mighty forces together, and that's nature and her resilient capacity to bounce back, and our learning as humans, taking the best of what we've discovered about growing food and perhaps having the courage to discard the stuff that hasn't worked out quite so well in the long run. Conventional organic farmers, environmentalists, scientists, business, governments, NGOs, and consumers, we can all play our part in that. We may need to shift our positions a little bit. We may need to open our minds slightly, but when we do, the reward is meeting each other on that fertile, biodiverse, carbon-packed, earthworm-loaded common ground. So we're going to leave it there. Thank you to all of our speakers and our panelists for sharing their time and their thoughts today. And thank you to you watching for sharing your time as well. I know it's not easy to sit in front of a webinar for 90 minutes, so thank you, and I hope it was worthwhile. Take care, stay safe, and bye-bye.